Hi, I'm Ashley from Sunnymade, and today we are going to talk quilting terminology. Welcome back. I'm so excited to be back and to be going along this year. I kind of wanted to start from very basics, and what could be more basic than terminology. So I kind of wanted to sit down, talk to you a little bit about quilting terminology, what you might hear as we go along, so you have a better understanding of what I am talking about. Obviously, if we get to a point that you do have questions, you want me to explain something a little bit more, just leave it down in the comment section below, and I'll either answer it in there or I'll come back and make another video that goes into a little more detail. I'm always looking for good ideas, so your question may end up in a video. So that's super exciting. In a couple weeks, we are going to be working on a new quilt. It happens to be this one that is right behind me. This is called Sunny Stars. I thought it was very fitting for a quilt that I'm going to be giving away to you guys. So what you'll do is you'll put in a email address, and I will send the quilt pattern to you to your email. You can download it, you can print it up, whatever you want to do with it. And in a couple of weeks, we are going to work on it. All it does is take a layer cake or a 10-inch square, some yardage, backing, batting, all those things to finish a quilt, and we can get started on it. So go ahead and get it downloaded so you can gather your materials and we can get started on it. That link to have it sent to your email is down in the description box. So here I am holding my words, my little sticky notes. I was trying to decide what I wanted to go by, and I was trying to put them in order that I thought would be most reasonable, most logical. I don't know if I did, but so let's go ahead and get started. First, I want to talk about the parts of a quilt. Okay, when we are making a quilt, we first start by making blocks. For example, this is a quilt block. A lot of times in quilt patterns, it's like you're going to make 15 quilt blocks. And that's what this is. It is a piece of the quilt. Now, terminology-wise, on top of it, there is something called a finished size and a unfinished size. So your finished size is what you're going to see in the quilt, and your unfinished size is this. The difference is your seam allowance. And yes, I will talk about seam allowance. In general, we sew a 1/4-inch seam allowance. I guess now's the good time to talk about seam allowance. A 1/4-inch seam allowance means that we sew a 1/4-inch from the edge of the quilt. And if we're sewing a 1/4-inch all the way around, you're going to be getting rid of a 1/4-inch of your block. So if a finished size quilt block is 12 inches, this is not 12 inches, but in our example is 12 inches, our unfinished size is 12.5 inches. So in the quilt, you're going to see it 12 inches. And then when you add that edging for the seam allowance, you're going to end up at 12.5 inches. So if you get to a point in your quilt pattern that it says unfinished block size is 12.5 inches, when you get to this point and you're trimming your squares, they need to be 12.5 inches. I hope that makes sense. So here is a quilt block. It's the very basic part of your quilt. Next, I'm going to talk to you about sashing. In this quilt, we put all the quilt blocks directly together and they come together in their corners. However, sometimes patterns call for sashing, and what that does, if you'll notice in this one, you run a sashing strip, let's get that out, in between your quilt blocks. And so that just separates your quilt blocks a little bit to create space and depth. So your sashing is the pieces between your quilt blocks. Now, if it says setting squares, that's that square right here in the middle of your sashing. And sometimes they're in the corners too. So those are your sashing and your setting squares. Okay, next we're going to talk borders. This one, particularly, there are two borders on it. First I have a cream border and then I have a scrappy border. So this cream border here is actually called a stop border. A stop border stops you and changes direction, pretty much. It's usually something that frames up the quilt before you move on to the next step. So sometimes it's just a cream or a background color. Sometimes it's big and bold. Here I just did big and bold. This one is the final border. It's a scrappy border, or the way it's actually laid out with small strips, it's called a piano border, if you want to get a little more technical. So you have your stop border, you have your final border that is a piano border. Okay, next you have the backing. The backing on a quilt is the back of the quilt. Usually you use the same fabric for the whole back. A lot of times you can get specific backing that is for quilt backing. So it's made 108 inches, which is super nice when you have a nice big quilt. So this is a backing. You're going to have the pretty side out. And so that's your backing. Now batting, B-A-T-T-I-N-G, goes between the backing fabric and your quilt top, okay? Oh, let me talk about quilt top. A quilt top is your finished quilt here that is just your blocks, okay? Your blocks and your border. There is nothing else added to it. There's no binding, there's no backing, there's no quilting. It is just a quilt top, okay? So this is your quilt top. So batting goes between your quilt top and your backing. And it's what's going to give it the softness between, and it's also what's going to make it warm. And then last on your quilt is the binding. You have a nice binding. It finishes out the raw edges and it makes your quilt complete. Once you get the binding on, you have a whole quilt. Okay, what else might I want to talk about? So when it comes to talking about a quilt, when you piece the quilt is when you take all the fabric pieces for the quilt top and you put them together to make the blocks and the quilt top. So that is called piecing. Now, when you hook the front, the batting, and the backing together, that is called quilting. So that's all the little stitches on there. On this quilt, I actually used a darker thread, and you can see the quilting on it a lot more. So that is quilting, is when you hook them all together, and you can see it from the front and the back. Let me through my first sticky note. Okay, pieced, quilting, stash. Okay, if somebody says, I'm going to sew from my stash, what that means is all of us quilters that have lots of fabric laying around that needs to have something done to it. So our stash usually means our stash of fabric that needs to be made into quilts. Okay, let's talk about fabric and yardage now. So with the fabric is, if you, usually this is on a bolt like this, okay? It's wrapped this way. With the fabric is fabric from one side to the other, from one salvage edge to the other. So then my next word would be salvage. Salvaged is the edge of the fabric right here. Usually it has a little fraying, it's tougher, it's not normal fabric, and we cut the salvage edge off of it before we use it. So with the fabric, whoops, got to get it together, is the fabric from one salvage edge to the other. So if a quilt pattern says cut 2.5 inches by width of fabric, we are going to cut 2.5 inches from here in a strip. Okay, so that is with the fabric. Also, let's talk fabric and how it comes. So there are fabric lines. When a designer puts out fabric, they usually put out a fabric line. It can be anywhere from, I've seen fabric lines that had 8 different fabrics in it, and fabric lines that have 42 different bolts of fabric in it. So what it is, it's several different fabrics that go together. They match in color, they'll match in style, they'll usually have a little bit of each. It'll be like there'll be small prints and large prints, there'll be florals, and then there'll be dots. So it comes in a wide range. I love fabric lines because they allow you to get fabric that look well together, that have all been designed to go together, and they work together well. Now, when you have a fabric line, they also put out precuts. I'm actually going to do a whole video about precuts and about fabric lines, but I will do a quick terminology on precuts. What that is, let me pull this one out. This is a fabric line, and these are all fat quarters. I will discuss fat quarters in my pre-cut video, but what this does is give me a fat quarter in each of the fabrics in this fabric line. And so it gives me an opportunity to already have something that's all cut. I don't have to have them cut it at the fabric store. I can take this bundle home and get straight to work. Okay, let's talk about terminology in a quilt block. Let me pull this quilt block back out. This is one I'm actually designing. So let's talk about what a half square triangle is. It is this piece right here where you have a square that is cut down the middle diagonally with 2 triangles, and each triangle is a different color or different type of fabric. It could be the same color, but a lot of times they're 2 different colors. So these are called half square triangles. A lot of quilts have them. I love them. They're super easy to make. Okay, next is a flying geese. And here's actually 2 different types of flying geese. So a lot of times in a quilt pattern, you see flying geese. This is a flying geese right here. Okay, it's a rectangle shape that has a point in the middle, and these 2 match, same fabric. Well, sometimes they're different fabrics, but these 2 match, and then you have the point in the middle. Now, technically the point in the middle is the geese, because when you see geese flying in the air, they're in a V shape back this way. So a lot of times in a quilt pattern, you'll see it with these smaller triangles are the colored ones, and the inside is the background. However, if you look at this flying geese right above it, you have the center is the pattern fabric, and the two triangles are the background fabric. So there's actually lots of fun things you can do with this, with both half square triangles and flying geese, and you can make some super fun patterns. Let me show you a few others. So here we have flying geese that have the dark inside. So that is fun with flying geese. This one's also flying geese, but when you put it this way, with the colored here and the background here in the middle, you get stars. And that's actually what you see up here are the star pattern. I actually used half square triangles. This is a good one right here because it's nice and dark. I used half square triangles on this. So you have the background, you have the colored fabric, and you have that diagonal line, and it creates that star. So flying geese and half square triangles. I don't really have a good example of this next word. Right now, I don't have any work in progress quilts. So, but I did want to go over a dog ear. A lot of people talk about dog ears. Cut off your dog ears. So if you look at this fabric that I'm sewing here, and my seam goes up the back, and I flip it over, and I have this little triangle sticking out. This extra triangle, that is called a dog ear. So if somebody says you need to trim off your dog ears, you're just going to come and give that a nice snippet and get it trimmed off. Now these ones are Eleanor Burns flying geese. So that's why this looks like this. This could be also considered a dog ear, but this is meant for a different type of block. So I'm not going to say that that's a dog ear. Okay, let's also talk about quilt blocks. A lot of times you just have quilt blocks that are laid out. You have like a 4x5 pattern, 4 across, 5 down quilt pattern. Okay, and they look like this. Now, if one is called for being on point, instead of putting your blocks in your quilt like this, you are rotating them, and they are going to look like a diamond as opposed to a quilt, or as opposed to a square. So this is on point, meaning the point is the top of the quilt, and the point goes towards the bottom and the sides of a quilt. I had to look real quick to see if I had something to show you, but I don't. Now, when we go like this, there's a couple things that happen. Is you then end up with partial pieces of a quilt block in the corners to fill in that spot because they're not all nice, neatly lined up. Or you put in a piece of fabric that's background fabric, and it's a triangle. You call them setting triangles that fill in that spot between your quilt blocks along the edge, because otherwise you'd end up with a very jagged edge. Okay, we are almost done. I have a few more terminology. So first, let's talk about seam allowance. I know I touched on it. In general, a quilt seam allowance is 1/4 inch. So that's what you talk about. If it says a scant, SCANT, 1/4 inch, what it wants you to do is sew, instead of right at exactly 1/4 inch, just this side of a 1/4 inch. So you're actually sewing slightly less than 1/4 inch. That's what scant means. I understand why they do that, but I also find that if I'm sewing a lot of scant 1/4 inches, that my quilt block ends up bigger than I want it to be. So you kind of have to be careful with that and make sure that you are sewing correctly as you're doing it. Okay, my next terminology is stitch in a ditch, What that actually means is you are stitching right in the seam between two pieces. Actually, we'll hide that seam line in um, in between the pieces. Now, where I use stitch in a ditch is in my binding. I do a faux double binding and I stitch in that ditch right between the two colors so that it hits it right there all along the way, all the way around my quilt. So let's talk about quilting then. So now that we've pieced and put our quilt top together, it is time to quilt it. Remember I told you that quilting is when we hook the back and the front together with the batting in the middle. If you want to do it on your home machine, you're always welcome to do that, but you can actually have someone long arm it. What this is a really big machine that allows you to hook your quilt on it, and there's roller bars and it pulls it nice and tight, and it allows you to put a whole quilt top on it at one time. And then there's a machine on the sewing machine part is on top of it, and it allows you to move it and quilt it usually from side to side. And then a long arm will say have like 18 inches where you quilt it, okay, is available, and you quilt it from one side to the other, and then you roll it and you quilt the next 18 inches. Long arms are available in quilt shops. Our local quilt shop that I like to go to rents out a long arm, so I had to do a certification class to learn how to work the long arm. And they also have a long arm that the employees use, and they will quilt your quilt for you. And sometimes you can find people that have one in their home and they use it as a business to quilt quilts. And it usually depends. It can range anywhere from 1 to, I even saw one that was 4 cents a square inch the other day. So per square inch, that's how much they charged, you know. And there's 2 different ways to do a long arm. There's called a Pantagraph, where you do it edge to edge. It's one design. It goes from one side all the way to the other. It's kind of like a typewriter. You follow this design and they make it all flowy and it works well together in each line. So you do it one side and then you bring your machine back and you do just the next line. Or I've been getting into free motion, and this allows me to just decide how I want to do it as I'm sewing. And this one includes loops and flowers, and you can pretty much put anything you want on your quilt when you free motion. I have a Halloween quilt that I put spider webs on, and that was super fun to do as well. The last thing I want to go over is a Scrappy quilt. We can make these beautiful quilts that have a full fabric line in them, and you can use pre-cuts or you can get fabric cut. I got fabric cut for this one. Okay, but when I get done, I'm going to have pieces left, and there's still going to be pieces of these fabrics that are big enough that you can use in a quilt, and these are called your scraps. And I have a couple of bins. I save them different ways, but what quilters, some quilt pattern makers like to do is make quilt patterns just for your scraps. And you can just pull from your stash. We talked about stash. Pull from your stash and you can have a whole quilt that is made just from your scraps. And that's super nice because you're not having to go buy new stuff. You already have it. You can pull it and cut it and use what you already have and get it out of your house in the storage bin that is at the top of your closet, because that's where I store mine. Okay, did I miss something? I think I might have missed something. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comment section below. I hope this helped a whole bunch, and I hope you didn't get bored halfway through. Again, Go sign up to get your quilt pattern so you can gather your supplies so we can work on that in a couple weeks. I hope you have a great week and happy sewing.